We got any children of the 70s or 80s here this morning? A few of you guys, all right. Only a few, okay. Nobody wants to admit that they're that old. Well, I was a child of the 80s, and I remember growing up outside of town on a little farm, and we didn't get cable TV. We only had a few channels that we got with the rabbit ears on our television, and one of those channels that we got was PBS, and on PBS, there was a guy named Bob Ross. Any guy? Okay, Bob Ross, he had a big afro, and he was a painter, and the show was called The Joy of Painting. And this was, I don't know if I chose it. I was enthralled by it as a little kid. I would turn it on, and it would be one of the only shows on TV, and I would just watch Bob Ross, and he would have this palette. He had this palette of all these different colors, and he would just like start putting colors on this canvas. And I just remember being just in 30 minutes, this guy took a blank canvas and he made it into like this beautiful nature scene of art. And I remember wondering the whole time, like, what is he creating? Like, what is this going to turn into? And he's like moving colors around, mixing colors, and he's painting this picture. And then at the end of 30 minutes, I was like, wow. So that was, this is a specific memory from my childhood. So perhaps you remember Bob Ross, Mr. Painter Fro guy, and you've had that experience as well. But John, we've been looking at the book of John, the Gospel of John, and the Apostle John is an artist. He very much thinks like an artist, and he is painting a picture through his book. And he is using a palette, and he is trying to help us see something that he sees, help us understand something that he understands, help us see the beauty of who God is. And this is one of the reasons why John is one of my favorite books of the Bible, maybe my favorite book of the Bible, is not only because John is just because he's telling us information, but he is so careful, creative, and he's just taking colors from God's history, from the Old Testament, and he is painting something in a way that is unique and is unique to John. And he wants us to see God and understand God and his truth and his kingdom and who Jesus is in a very specific way. And so you can imagine John with his palette, and so this is my little palette. And he's got this palette of images and colors that he's painting a picture with: creation, light, darkness, sea, water, Exodus, and Moses. And he's drawing all of these things. He's taking all these colors from the scriptures, from the history of God's people. Let me start on the first one, just really quick. In the creation account, Genesis chapter 1, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening, and there was morning the first day. And God said, 'Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water.' So God made the vault and separated the water from the vault from the water above it. And so it was called sky, and there was evening and there was morning, and the God creates land, and he separates the physical material land from the water." So this is the Genesis 1 account. And then so John goes to start his book. Now listen to this. John chapter 1. He starts his book this way. He says, "In the beginning was the Word." So you notice the parallel, right? The echo. In the beginning, Genesis 1. In the beginning, John 1. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." And so John takes this color from Genesis 1, and he starts to paint this picture as he starts his book. And he's like, "I want you to see something. I want you to see the picture and the beauty, which I'm going to paint for you." And so he takes these creation themes, and there's tons of them in the book of John, and we obviously won't be getting into all of them, but he's taking these creation themes and he weaves them, he paints them into this canvas. He takes these themes of light and darkness, and he wants us to understand something about who Jesus is and that he is bringing light into darkness. He takes the themes of sea and water. And if you go through the Old Testament, and even Genesis 1, but it goes through the Old Testament, sea is understood in that Eastern world as the place of chaos, the place of darkness and unknown. And so in the ancient mind, the sea was this mystery of things beneath the surface that you didn't know what was down there, and it was dark, and it was powerful, and sometimes it was calm, and sometimes it was chaotic, and it would capsize boats, and so it was seen as like this place of evil. And often when you read through the Psalms, you'll see references to sea monsters, because they just saw this sea as kind of this manifestation of chaos and evil. And then as you read through John, you'll hear echoes of the Exodus. And so if you're unfamiliar with the Old Testament story, one of the most significant parts of Israel's history was that they were captives in Egypt for 400 years. And so they were slaves in Egypt, and then God came to deliver them, and God sent Moses. He called Moses to deliver God's people from Egypt. And so there's a series of events there and plagues, and eventually Pharaoh relents and lets Moses take the people out of Egypt, and then Pharaoh changes his mind and chases the people, and they get to this edge of the wilderness, and they're at the edge of the Red Sea, and there's the Pharaoh's army on one side, the sea on the other side, and then God leads Moses and his people through the Red Sea to the other side where they thought was going to be the promised land, and then they ended up in the wilderness for 40 years. And so all of these themes are actually echoed in John's book. And so you can see that John is like taking the palette of the Old Testament. He's like, let me paint this picture for you. Let me help you to see reality and God in a new and profound way. And so John's an artist. Not only has John used these Old Testament images, he has a certain way that he's organizing his topics. And one of those ways, as we've looked at in this series, are through 7 signs, 7 miracles. And there's many other miracles that Jesus did, but John picked 7, and he calls them signs, not miracles, again, because the word miracle is the Greek word dunamis, which is like dynamite, and John is saying, when we think of miracles, we often think that the miracle was the point, but he's not saying the miracle was the point. He's saying the miracle is simply a sign. The miracle is intended to show us the reality about who God is, what God is like, and it's intended to draw our eyes past the sign to something else, to something bigger, to something more eternal. And what people repeatedly miss in the book of John is that they think the sign is the point, and they get enthralled with the signs, and Jesus is saying, no, these are pointing you towards a greater reality. And so as we journey through the book of John, we've specifically been journeying through the 7 signs that John uses in his book. And so we get to sign number 5 today, which John is going to use the palette that we've talked about from the Old Testament to paint a picture. And sign number 5 is Jesus walking on water. There's parallels to the story in 2 other gospel books, in the Gospel of Mark in chapter 6 and Gospel of Matthew in chapter 14. John is the briefest out of all 3 of those accounts. And so it's a very short passage. And John and Mark have very common emphasis. They're kind of making a similar point. Mark's account is a little more detailed than John's. And so if you hear me adding some info that is in addition to the text that we're reading, it's because I'm drawing on Mark's text and filling in a little bit of the gaps to help us understand the story. So we're here, sign number 5, Jesus walking on water. We ready? All right, here we go. John 6:16. And so just as a bit of a backdrop, this comes on the heels of the story that we read last week, sign number 4, where Jesus feeds the 5,000, more like 15,000. And so they were in the wilderness. Okay, they were in the wilderness. They were without food, and Jesus shows up and provides them manna or bread. So John is taking a theme from Exodus, and he's helping us paint the picture of who Jesus is in light of that Old Testament story, the Exodus story, where his people were in the wilderness and he provided them food. And so this is coming on the heels of that echo, that color, that brushstroke. And then right in the middle of that story, John interrupts that story with the story of Jesus walking on the water. So when evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. And so they're going to Capernaum. In fact, the reason they're going to Capernaum is because Jesus commanded them to go there. Jesus tells his disciples where to go, and he tells them what to do, and he tells them to get into the boat. And again, we know this from Mark that the disciples didn't just decide on their own, hey, I'm going to get into the boat, we're going to go there. Mark says that Jesus commanded them to do this. And so he sent them into the boat to go across the lake to the other side. Except he didn't go with them. He didn't go in the boat with them. And Jesus was about to send them across the lake knowing that there's a storm that was coming that was going to come onto the lake. I mean, Jesus, God with flesh on, the word that became flesh, we just read that in John 1, is all-knowing. And so, it's kind of like Jesus checks out the weather app and he says, I know what's going to happen. And he says to his disciples, hey, why don't you go to the other side? And there's this vicious storm that's about to roll in an hour. He says, trust me, it'll be great. Go to the other side, go to Capernaum. And then he sends them into the boat, and he doesn't go into the boat with them. So why would the one with all wisdom and all knowledge send his disciples knowingly into a boat into the middle of a storm? It's a good question. It's a good question. Why would God, who knows all things, send his followers into the sea, into chaos, into a storm, knowing what they were going to encounter? Jesus himself, after he got baptized, it says in the scriptures that he came out of the waters, and then Jesus was led by the Holy Spirit into the wilderness where he would be tempted. Why would God send his followers into the wilderness, into the storm, knowing that there was going to be chaos in front of them? Why would God lead you into a storm? That's a good question. Perhaps it's a question that you've asked many times in your life. Why, God, is this happening to me? Why would you allow this to happen to me? This is a human question. Anybody who has faith in an all-powerful, good God will inevitably ask this question at some point in their life. God, if you're all-powerful, if you are good, why would you allow this to happen? In fact, God doesn't just allow it. Jesus sends them into it. So if you've ever had that question, the message this morning is for you. So by now, John says it was what? Dark. Okay, so John's painting this picture, right? And so is it literally it was dark? Yes, but John also has these echoes, and he's very intentional. He doesn't really say things by accident. It was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. So they were leaving light. They're going into darkness, and Jesus was not with them. They're about to go onto a journey without Jesus. And so as they head out into this boat, we got to remember that at least 4 of these 12 disciples that Jesus is sending into the boat are fishermen. There might be more fishermen than just the 4, but we know at least 4 of them are fishermen. And so they were professional fishermen. They had spent their lives on the lake. In fact, they'd spent their lives on this specific lake. They knew this lake really, really well. They knew how to navigate the lake. They knew how to drive a boat. And so these guys were expert fishermen. And so they're heading out in the boat, and a strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. And so this is significant. This isn't just like some little storm. These are expert fishermen who are encountering something that was on a whole nother level. I grew up, so when I was a teenager, I spent my summers working at a camp, and we had a little lake there at the camp, and I was the boat driver at the camp. And so there was a ski class, and I did the ski class and drove the boat, and then there was a canoeing class. And you can imagine how much fun it was sending a bunch of 7- and 8-year-olds out onto a canoe with paddles. And so we had this whole lake to ourselves, and some days were windier than others, and the wind would come in some days, and I'd wake up in the morning knowing, oh, great. And because kids would get blown across the lake, so the lake would come through and would blow all these kids across the lake. They had no strength to be able to navigate the wind. And they get blown into the reeds, and there's all these reeds at the end of the lake. And so half of my time as a boat driver was spent retrieving little kids from the reeds. I'm supposed to be teaching skiing, but I'm rescuing canoers. And so all these kids are just they're all in the reeds. And I remember there was one particular day where there's all these boats in the reeds. It was super windy. And so I go out there in the boat to try and retrieve these kids. And it was a nonprofit camp. It was a Christian camp. And so, we're running by donations. And let's just say the boat was not the greatest boat in the world. It broke down often. And so this boat breaks down on this windy day. We were prepared for this because we had paddles in the boat. And so I had, all these little kids in the boat with me. And then I had all these canoers out in the reeds. And we spent the day, so the boat goes out there, it breaks down. And then we got to gather all these kids. So we get these kids, we got the canoes attached to the boat. And I'm on the front of this boat, canoeing. We have paddles in the boat, canoeing. And I'm like, kids are on their canoes. And we're all trying to get across the lake. The wind was too much for us. And even in spite of having that powerboat, it did nothing for us. So the disciples, they're experts. They've been on this lake many, many, many times. And they're coming across the strong wind that was blowing. And because the wind was blowing, the waves were growing, the waters grew rough. And so we see that there's two elements that are correlating to prevent the disciples from getting across the lake from where they were to Capernaum, from point A to point B. And so they're coming across wind. And wind is resistance. And so wind can either come at your back and it helps you, or when it's coming against you, it hurts you. And so wind is something that is blowing against you in the opposite direction that you are trying to go. I don't know if you've had that experience. I know that you have. When you're trying to go somewhere where you think you ought to go. In fact, you might be convinced that the Lord told you, go across the lake, go to this place. And then you go to where you think God is telling you to go, living how you think God has called you to live, and you are met with resistance. Maybe it's internal resistance. Maybe you have negative thought patterns or negative self-talk. Maybe depression or anxiety, things that as you step forward, you're like, there's all this resistance that makes me want to turn around and go the other way so the wind's at my back. Maybe it's external resistance. Maybe certain situations, certain people and other voices in your life that are discouraging you from going in the direction that you feel called to go. And so the wind was coming against them. They're coming against this resistance. And there's also waters that are growing rough. And so if you remember, waters throughout Scripture represent, the sea specifically represents chaos. It represents chaos. It represents disorder. It represents this mysterious forces that come against us. Both the Old Testament and New Testament reveal that the ancient world, that the sea was considered a place of terror and unknown, insecurity, potential disaster. Remember Genesis 1? We just read it. That God comes, the earth was formless and empty, and then God starts to bring order out of chaos. This is the Genesis 1 creation story. And so part of how he does that is he separates the waters and he puts land into the created order, and then he starts putting things in order where there was disorder. If you go to Revelation 21, so the first chapter of your Bible talks about the sea and the chaos, and then Revelation 21 also talks about the sea, John's vision of a new heaven. It says that there will be no more sea. How many of you guys love being by the sea? Any ocean people here? Yeah. And you read Revelation 21, you're like, that sucks. I'm not sure if I want to go to heaven. I like the sea. Well, let me encourage you. It's not actually talking about the literal sea. What Revelation 21 is showing you is that if there's no more sea, what that means is that the chaos and disorder that we know in this world, that we've experienced as human beings, will be no more. That God is going to reorder everything the way it was supposed to be. In fact, in another picture in Revelation, it says that the sea was glass, which is another way of saying there was complete peace and calm. The waves and the chaos are no more. And so what's creating chaos in your life? Instability in your life? Is there particular relationships that are creating chaos? Maybe work, finances, addictions. I don't know about you, but as I look at the news feeds of what's happening in our world, it feels a little bit chaotic, doesn't it? It's like, can we just get a break? Will everything ever be okay? And right when you think you get past one, it's like the next thing shows up. We live in this unstable world, this unstable society. It's chaotic. There's waves. And so the disciples of Jesus, they're trying to, at Jesus' command, get in the boat and get from point A to point B, go from where they were to Capernaum. And they're met with resistance, things that are coming against them. And they're met with instability and disorder. And so as John is painting this picture, I think his readers, both then and now, as we read this, we're like, I get this. This is my story. You know, I feel like I'm trying to do the right thing, and I'm being met with nothing but resistance and waves. And it says, when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles. So this lake that's being described is 12 miles long, north to south, and at its widest point is 7 miles east to west wide. At its more narrow points, which is probably where they were, given the geography that John gives, it's about 5 miles. And so when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, this is John's way of saying is that they've gotten most of the way. They worked hard. They paddled hard for 3 or 4 miles, and they had gotten the majority of the way across the lake, and they could probably just see. They could see where they were trying to get to, and they couldn't even get there. They got past the halfway point, the point of no return, where you're like, we're almost there, but they just can't get there. So John uses distance to describe this journey. He says they've gone so far. When you read the Gospel of Mark, Mark uses time to describe how long and how far they've gone. He says that at this point, it was the 4th watch of the night. And so in that time in the first century, they talked about 4 watches of the night. And so the first watch of the night was from about 6 to 9 p.m. The second watch of the night was from 9 to 12 p.m. Third watch, 12 to 3 a.m. And the fourth watch was 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., the last watch before dawn. And so the way Mark describes it is that these guys have been rowing all night, and they've been rowing hard, and they're exhausted, and they can't go anymore, and they get to the 4th watch of the night. I don't know if you've ever set out in a direction that you thought you ought to go. You know, the first watch is pretty easy. Got lots of faith in the first watch. I love the first watch. You know, you're full of enthusiasm, like, this is where we're going. Jesus told me where to go. I'm going there. And then you get to the second watch, and you're like, okay, this is taking a little longer than we thought, but that's okay. Let's do this. And then you get to the third watch. You know, you're like, I'm tired. All this resistance, all these waves. Did we make the wrong decision? And then you get to the 4th watch. Does Jesus even know what he's talking about? Was he crazy? Why did he tell us to go? I just want to give up. Maybe we heard Jesus wrong. Let's just turn around. I know we're almost there, but let's let the wind take us back to where we came from. 4th watch, faith. I think it's easy to have faith in the first watch. It's all optimism, everything's easy. But as time goes on, and you go through the different watches of the night, or you go through the different miles, and it seems like the closer you get, the further you are. A lot of us, I think, when we get to the 4th watch of the night, we turn around, we want to turn around, and we think maybe we didn't hear him right, or maybe God doesn't have our best interests in mind. And that assumes something. It assumes that God's goals and your goals are the same. It assumes that God's goals for you are the same goals that you have for you. And inevitably, when you get to the 4th watch, how do you know you're in the 4th watch? Inevitably, when you get to the 4th watch of the night, or that last mile, you start to ask the question, Jesus, where are you? Which is a fantastic question. Jesus, where are you? And so where is Jesus in this story? Well, Jesus commands them to go into the boat, to go across the lake. He tells them where to go, knowing he's going to send them a storm. And then it says that he goes up on the mountainside to pray. And Mark 6:46 says, after leaving them, he went up on the mountainside to pray. And then it says, he saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. He saw them. And it wasn't just like this omnipotent God sees you. It was like this physical. He's literally on a hillside beside the lake, can see the lake, and sees the disciples struggling at the oars, not able to make it all the way across. And the disciples are in the boat on the fourth watch at their wits' end. Jesus, where are you? And the truth that we see in the story is just because you can't see Jesus doesn't mean he doesn't see you. Just because you can't see him doesn't mean he doesn't see you. Just because you don't know where he is doesn't mean he doesn't know you. And so maybe that's an encouragement to you, but let's be honest. As I was thinking about this, I'm like, that's not that encouraging. Come on. It's not that encouraging. So there's this first level of faith that is like, is God real? God, do you see any of this? And then you get to the second level of faith. There's like, God is real. God sees it. And you're like, whew. And then you're like, wait a second. God, you see this? And you're not saving me from this? And so there's another level of faith crisis. And so Jesus sends them into the storm, knowing that they're going to go into the storm, and he's watching them. And they get to the fourth watch, and they can't go anymore. They're exhausted. It says, when they rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. John and Mark both emphasize the same point, that the disciples are struggling. They're encountering a storm that is a great level that they don't know how to navigate. They get to the end of their own resources, their own ability, and they can't move forward anymore. And then Jesus shows up walking on the water, and their response was not joy, but fear. Mark and John both say this. Then they grew afraid. And so before we continue the story, we just have to pause and recognize the relationship between fear and faith. Because fear and faith are siblings. So if you think about fear, fear limits your freedom. Fear dictates your behavior. When you're afraid of something, it prevents you from acting in a certain way. And I've said this many times from stage, but I'm afraid of heights. Because I'm afraid of heights, it has prevented me from doing all sorts of things. You know, if you come to my house at wintertime, you may see my wife hanging Christmas lights at our house. And you're like, shame on you, Matt. I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. I'm afraid of heights. I have a hard time getting on the roof, okay? I'll just being honest. And I got a gracious, understanding wife. But that fear has prevented me from doing many things in my life. It limits certain things that I'm like, I would like to do that, but I can't because I'm afraid of that. And every year when we go down to Mexico, for years, we'd stop at Primm, which is just outside of Las Vegas, and there's a roller coaster in Primm. How many of you guys have ridden that roller coaster? Only a few of you guys? Okay, a few of you. All right, there we go. I'm afraid of heights, and it's like one of those old wooden rickety, like you can, like from miles away, you can hear it. It's like, it feels like it's about to fall apart, and it looks like it's been there for a very, very long time. And so every year, we stop, and like everybody gets off, and they ride the roller coaster, and I'm just standing there, I'm watching, and I'm like, can't do it. And so years went by, 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 12 years. I was going every single year, and every year I would just watch all these people go on the roller coaster, and I would go get my Starbucks because that was safer than riding the roller coaster, okay? And finally, the last year that I was being the youth pastor, I didn't know when I was going to go to the Mexico trip again. I'm like, this could be my last year. And I'm like psyching myself. That whole day I knew we were going to stop at Primm. I'm like, I can do this. And then I got to this point where we did stop, and we stopped at Primm, and I had I had this fear of heights that was stopping me all these years from doing it. But then I had another fear. I had a fear of regret. I said, if I don't ride this roller coaster this year, I may never get to ride this roller coaster. And so all of a sudden, my fear of regret trumped my fear of heights. And I was terrified on both ends. And I was like, I remember getting in line. I had the money to pay for it. I'm in line. My heart was like beating out of my chest, and that line is getting shorter and shorter. And I'm like, I should jump ship. I should get out. And then I just kept coming back to, this is your last chance. You're never going to ride this again. If you don't do it today, you never will. And all this fear is just like, yeah, I'm doing it. And I did it. Yeah, thank you. Woohoo. And I remember John Clausen, who's at SunWest, he was riding the roller coaster, and we were going up, and his phone fell out of his pocket as we're at the top. I'm like, yeah, that could be me. I was like, that's why I hate heights. So fear has this thing where it controls us, it dictates our behavior, and this is why fear and faith are siblings. They're related. Because what you fear most is what ends up dictating your behavior. And it's not until I had FOMO, until I feared something more than the fear of heights, that I challenged my fear of heights. Fear is sometimes the result of us placing our faith in the wrong thing. And it's often the things that we fear most is where we trust God least. And I think this is why in Proverbs 9, verse 10, it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And I would add to that and say the fear of the Lord, it's not the end of wisdom, but it's the beginning of wisdom. And so many of us, we live our lives dictated by fear, which is we're trusting the wrong things. We have faith in the wrong place. And it's not until we come across something more powerful, something bigger than the fear that we have, that we change our behavior. And so what is happening here on the boat? The disciples are afraid. They got to their wits' end. They don't know what to do. And you think when Jesus shows up, they'd be overjoyed, but they are paralyzed by fear. When they saw Jesus walking on the water, they were frightened. They were afraid. Why? Well, these fishermen, these disciples, they're good Jewish boys. They know their scriptures. They know their Old Testament. They have an understanding of what God said in the past. And here's some highlights that John understands as he's painting this picture for us. The voice of the Lord, this is from Psalms. The voice of the Lord is what? Over the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord thunders over the mighty waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is majestic. Job 9, verse 8. He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. Remember, their understanding was the water, the sea, is the place of evil and chaos. It was uncontrollable. You couldn't tame it. And then Job says, he alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. God alone. The water saw you, God. The water saw you and writhed, and the very depths were convulsed. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters. Though your footprints were not seen. Again, even echoes of the Exodus story, right? John's painting with his palette. God led his people through the sea. Psalm 107, he stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm. He guided them to their desired haven. So back to the story. They saw Jesus walking on the rough, chaotic waters, and he was on the sea, and they're terrified. And then Jesus speaks, and he says to them, it is I, don't be afraid. It is I, don't be afraid. And we read that, and I mean, it sounds like a It's an encouraging phrase in English, but there's far more going on here. We're going to spend another series talking about this whole concept, but for now, we need to recognize that when Jesus says, "It is I," it's the Greek phrase ego eimi, which is I am. I am, don't be afraid. And so what the disciples are realizing, what Jesus confirms with his voice, is something they knew from the Old Testament, from the Exodus story. And so when God tells Moses to go into Egypt and to rescue his people and to stand up against Pharaoh, Moses says this: "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" And it says, God said to Moses, "I am who I am." In Greek, ego eimi. This is what you are to say to the Israelites: "I am has sent me to you." What kind of name is that? I am. It's the foundation of all being. It's the supreme reality, the very source of essence and existence. Remember in John 1 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word was God, and everything that we see came into existence through him and by him." Jesus shows up on the chaos, on the waves, in the water, in the face of the storm, and he says, "I am." And so we need to recognize that Jesus didn't minimize the ways he magnified himself. This was his response to the disciples in the storm. Before Jesus delivers them, before we see the miraculous ending where they're going to go to their destination, Jesus shows up in the storm and he magnifies himself before he minimizes the waves. So what's the answer to the question, "Jesus, where are you?" And what's the answer to the question, "Jesus, if you see me, then why aren't you doing anything?" And here's what the picture that John 6 paints for us is that no storm would mean no revelation. No storm would mean no transformation. God cares more about your transformation than your comfort. God's goals are not the same as our goals. The disciples get in the boat and they think, "I got to get from point A to point B," and that's the whole goal. Jesus sends them on the boat to point B, knowing that they're going to encounter a storm, because when they encounter the storm, Jesus is going to give them a transformative experience and revelation that actually magnifies their understanding of who Jesus is. They say, "My goal is to get to the other side." Jesus says, "My goal is to change their lives forever. To change who they are, to change how they see reality, to change their faith and fear relationship." And so Jesus says, "It is I am. Don't be afraid." And then it says they were willing to take him into the boat. Then they were willing to take him into the boat. And immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. What's fascinating, if you read Mark and Matthew and John, in Mark's account, Jesus gets on the boat and the sea is calmed. In John's account, Jesus gets in the boat and they get to the end of the shore. In Matthew's account, which is the most different, Jesus gets in the boat, and that's the account where Peter says, "Hey, if it's you, tell me to come and walk with you." And Peter gets out and he walks on the water. And I think all three gospel writers give us a different glimpse of different scenarios that happen in our lives. Sometimes Jesus shows up at the scene, and when he gets in our boat, he brings us to the other side. Sometimes Jesus shows up in the scene in Mark's account, and he gets in the boat, and we don't get to the other side, but he brings a peace and a calm where we are. And sometimes Jesus gets in the boat, and he doesn't calm the waves at all, but he empowers us to walk on the chaos and the waves and not to be overcome by the waves as long as we keep our eyes on Jesus. In John's account here, they hear Jesus' response, and it says they are willing, and they let him into the boat. And so my question simply is, are you willing? Are you willing to allow Jesus to be the supreme and sovereign authority and power in your life? Regardless of what wind resistance you're feeling, what chaos you're going over, what fear you're experiencing, are you willing to let Jesus dictate your life and your behavior and your posture? Or perhaps you just feel like, I'm going to try this a little bit longer. I'm going to see if I can get there by myself. Perhaps you're only at the second watch and you're like, I'm going to keep going because I think I can. Or maybe you're ready for a power that's greater than yourself, greater than the storm. But he will only be received on his terms. And this is why Jesus allows them to experience the storm. And if you remember last week, we said sometimes God allows us to get to despair and realize we don't have the resources to answer the question. We don't have the solution for the question we're asking. In the same way, Jesus allows us to go through journeys and realize we don't have the strength to get to where we think we're supposed to go. And then we say, Jesus, are you watching? Are you there? And he allows us just to go far enough so that we know that we can't do it on our own strength. And he says, I am. Don't be afraid. It says they were willing and they took him into the boat. And when he got in the boat, they got to the other side. So may you keep rowing in the direction that God has called you with conviction and clarity and resilience. May you persevere through the first watch, the second watch, the third watch, the fourth watch. Do everything that you can on your own strength, obeying the word that the Lord gave you. But may you come to realize that there are some things that you just can't do. That Jesus is the great I am. That he's done for everything for you that you couldn't do for yourself. And may you, like the disciples, be willing to push aside other fears and allow Jesus to dictate your behavior. To be willing to bring Jesus into your boat and to say, Jesus, you are the sovereign I am. You are the one that I give control of. You are the Lord of the waves. No matter what resistance or chaos I'm going through, Jesus, you are Lord.